This is actually kind of a gossipy thing. This is entertainment. You're not going to learn a lot. You learn about some history and stuff, but it's not like you're going to walk away saying, I'm going to go create the next Google App Engine thing. So I want to make sure your expectations are in the right place here. They've asked me to mention that my compatriot Brian Fitzpatrick and Ben Collins Sussman will be giving a talk on Thursday at 2 o'clock about how your open source project can survive poisonous people. I believe my picture is up somewhere in there. No, I'm kidding. And then at 12:45 on the same day, they're going to talk about how we do open source project hosting. So they're really the authorities on that. So if you want to ask me questions about that, you're wasting your time, because I'm going to be like, Fitz, So that's good. Do you guys want a Q&A? Because I can always expand my speech to have less. You're saying no, but no, Q&A is cool because a lot of people have questions about how Google does open source. So I'm going to give like a 5-10 minute thing at the end for Q&A. So, hi. This is my talk. So I had this stump speech that I gave for the last 4 years called Google and Open Source. And I've given it a zillion times. And I have to be honest with you, I was like, it's getting kind of tired of it. So I tried out this other thing, and it was a 3-hour-long history of open source software. And while that's a good speech, it's quite long. And I've given that in 45 minutes, but it requires me to be really over-caffeinated. And it's a good talk, but then it feels a little too tight, right? And so we didn't want that. So I said, well, what if I brought them together? What if I said, okay, give you sort of an idea of sort of where open source has been, the kinds of things that I've been asked over the last 12 years of doing this professionally, and then bring it up to sort of where we are at Google and how we appreciate open source and how we release open source software and how we feel about it. So this is the result of that experiment. I've given this a couple of times. We're still working it out, but it's very, very simple. I use the word magic, which of course brings to mind Doug Henning. So the difference between Doug and I, Doug is skinnier than I am. He's sort of svelter. And I wear glasses. And yeah, it's funny because when I first gave this, I looked up Doug on Wikipedia because that's the first thing you do before you put up a picture of a famous, scary magician. And it turns out he's one of these yogic flyers. He can sit there and flex his legs and bounce. So he's one of these guys. But he's also dead. He died of cancer in 2000. So it's really an upbeat way to begin a talk. So who am I really? I'm the open source programs manager for Mountain View, California-based Google, a internet company. What that means is that I'm tasked with managing compliance with open source licenses, which is quite challenging in a company that has as many engineers as we do. Whenever we release code, everyone here today speaking is talking about code that we've released, and so our job is to make sure it's got the right licenses, that it's properly templated and boilerplated, and all these things that seem maybe a little minor but are really, really important from a philosophical point of view to me. And we run the summer of code, and we provide some insight into when APIs are launched, that we do so in such a way that's fair, right? So a lot of people don't think about this, but when you consume an API, you're basically entering into a funny kind of agreement with the company whose API you're consuming. You're saying, wow, I'm trusting you to provide this API for a while, and if you're not going to provide it, that you'll do certain things, and maybe I can move my service to another provider. Is that possible? And so we try to take a lot of the doubt out of the equation, and we try to make it a little more honest. So, for instance, you'll see things like non-asserts coming out of Google. You'll see that we've joined the Open Invention Network. You'll see these kinds of things. And the whole point of that is to say to you, the developer, exactly what we're doing when we create an API. So you can understand what sort of company you're dealing with. And we try to do it, well, I'll talk about this much later. And I don't want to give up like a slide in the beginning, because you would hate to miss a really good slide, right? Although you're in this talk, so you're giving a lot of really good slides. Use // podcasting, blah, 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 blah. It was funny. I was looking for a picture that was fancy pants on iStock Photo for the last one because I was like, ooh, look at me. If you know my educational background, you'll see why that's funny, but I won't go into that. Yeah, and I release software. It's fun to do. So our agenda today is very, very simple. Me, questions, and that's it. He's actually been indicted for selling those make money off the government for no money down kind of books late at night. I don't think he's been indicted, but when you type in question guy in Google, this is what you find. And that's exactly what I was looking for. Me, question guy, that's it. Most geeks, how many of you have seen this quote before? Actually, who hasn't seen this quote before? So, yeah, you've all seen this quote. And that's why, since open source does something a little unusual in that it gives you all of this functionality and all of this beauty through technology, it's magic, right? It does things that don't make any sense. And that's what I want to talk about. But what is open source, right? And a lot of you are saying, I already know this, dude. But remember, this is about me talking to you. So very simply, open source is software that is licensed by an open source initiative license, right? Very, very simple. This is the core idea. That's what open source is, right? And most of the time. So there's a lot. How many licenses does OSI have right now? 61? Yeah, so 61 licenses have been confirmed by the Open Source Initiative as being consistent with the open source definition. Well, the problem with that is you've got 8 licenses that cover 99.99999% of the code out there, and then you've got these onesie, twosie projects, right? And so when we think about open source at Google, and the way I personally feel about open source, is that you should concentrate on those big communities of software, right? The GPLs, the LGPLs, the LGPLs. Did I say that just now? Yeah. The LGPLs. The BSD, the LGPLs, the Apache, the LGPLs. And, you bring them all together, and that's going to be your big majority case, right? The MIT license is a good example, right? And then, when you start looking at the smaller communities, and I don't mean this as a diss, which is what the hip kids say today. I don't mean as to disrespect, like, for instance, the EPL. But that's a very popular license, but within one community, within the Eclipse community, which is very important. But I wouldn't release a piece of software unless it was part of Eclipse under that license. And actually, the company, Google, we've released things under the EPL because it was part of Eclipse. But otherwise, we'd never use the license, right? So it's a little bit of insight into how we think about these licenses. What isn't open source? So the Sun community. Source license isn't open source. Public domain can sort of kind of be open source, but sometimes it's not. And that's really unusual, right? Because you're like, well, wait a second, it's public domain. Anyone can use it. What are you talking about? Are you high? I'm not. I don't indulge in that kind of thing. But it's okay if you do, I guess. So public domain. Let's talk about that. There are some people who can release public domain software. And in fact, there are some organizations that can only release public domain software. There are parts of the U.S. government, for instance, who cannot apply copyright. They do not have copyright. It belongs to the people. If you're a U.S. citizen, it belongs to you. It belongs to all of us. And for us to do whatever we wish with this software. And they actually cannot put a license on it, right? There are a lot of organizations in the government like this. And so they release this public domain, and we actually trust them when they say this is being released as public domain. However, other organizations, other governments, may be in countries, for instance, that subscribe to the World Intellectual Property Organization's moral rights standards. That means that, for instance, if Denise is to create some piece of art and Simon is to buy it, and then, I don't know what your name is, I can call you Tom. Hi, Tom. And Tom should buy it from Simon for 10 times the price. He actually owes some money to Denise as part of that transaction. And it was meant to protect sculptors and painters and artists. But it actually had these very significant impacts on intellectual property in general, including software. So in some countries, you actually can't release things under public domain. You think you can, but you can't. So, and also we think it's a kind of a bad idea to encourage public domain release because it actually doesn't protect the people who are releasing software by giving the proper kinds of guarantees or lack thereof anyway, and release from liabilities that most even incredibly unencumbered open source licenses give. So these aren't open source, and they're not open source in some countries, but even in countries that allow public domain code, it's actually really bad for the people who are releasing the software. So when we've been presented with public domain code at Google, we actually go back to the people and we say, listen, can we actually get one under a more restrictive license, which a BSD and MIT and Apache when compared to public domain is? And they're like, sure, weirdo. Or they say no, and we just deal with it, and we say, okay, your funeral, But, it's actually not open source. Similarly, one of the things that I keep in the back of my head whenever somebody's talking to me about open source, but I know they have a profit motive going on, it's not that profit's bad. But when they start saying these control words, right? When they start saying things like, well, we charge by the CPU for that, or we charge by the access license, the client license, I'm thinking that's not open source anymore, even though I could tell you all kinds of ways of taking any open source license and wrapping it in such a way, in some mechanism, some other way of controlling intellectual property, and charging you whatever I want. But the reality is, once you start hearing words like that, you should think to yourself, that's probably not open source. Doesn't mean it's bad. Just means it's probably not open source. And you probably shouldn't put it in the same part of your head as real open source. So the magical origins of open source software. This is, as far as I can find, the earliest example of where open source came from. So on the right, you see, the origins of Unix, right? So Ken Thompson a Googler, which is awesome. Dennis Ritchie pounding away, implementing Unix in C on their mainframe. They gave a talk at Purdue in 1971, the year of my birth, to the fellow on the left, Kirk McCusick. And he was in the audience, and he's watching them talk about this implementation of Unix on the mainframe using this very portable language C, and he was just enthralled. He said, wow, I could take this information, I could take this code even maybe, but I could take this information and I could build Unix, and I could spread it around, and I can get people developing in this manner. This is very exciting. And it was exciting. It was really cool, because he went eventually to Berkeley, as you know, and this is where the Berkeley system distribution came from, which became the genesis for not just companies like Sun and Apollo at the time and others, but also was the genesis of what became a movement that inspired literally tens of thousands of programmers, hundreds of thousands of programmers all around the world to work on these BSD-related tools and all the rest. And so this was incredibly exciting. And of course, it wasn't 100,000 in 1971, but you have to get your start somewhere. So this is an important story. Similarly, in 1984, you're laughing because this is Richard Stallman in Lego form. It's funny, the lawyers are like, do you have a license for that image? I'm like, Excuse me, I shouldn't breathe into the mic. Sorry about that. The gal on the right is actually just as important, though, and I want to explain why. So this, well, not the gal, but the printer, right? Sorry. So the printer is an important printer. This is the first Xerox laser printer that was delivered to the MIT AI lab, right, over at CSAIL. Now this printer is important because it teaches a lot of lessons, right? The most important lesson is the one that it taught Richard. But there's another lesson I want to explain about standards and why you should pay attention to standards, even ones that get no news or no name. So this printer was a remarkable printer. It would print out. You're like, why is he telling me about a printer? This printer would print out 2 pages every second. That's remarkably fast, right? We're talking about the early 80s right now. We're not talking about something you get free with your MacBook when you order it from Apple, okay? This is a significant machine. Embedded inside it is a PDP-11 computer, right? And this was expensive. This is a big printer. This is, about the width. It's big, right? You can see. You got eyes. And when they were building it out, they were like, wow, with this laser, we could deliver 360 dots per inch. It's never been done before. And that matches up really well with how printing in the large presses is done. That's what we should do. Engineers came back and said, no. If we do that, it's going to cost us much extra in terms of RAM and memory. They're like, well, what do we have to dial it down to so that we can do our 2 pages per second? They said, well, if we dial it back to 300, that'll work. And so now when you buy a printer, it's always in measures of 300, 600, 1,200, 2,400, 4,800 dots per inch. And it's because of that printer. That math came from that printer. And because memory was just that much more expensive. And what's funny about it is that same memory problem, because they dialed it back, right? They actually didn't do it right. They had a screwed up buffer. And so when the fellow on the left, the Lego figure there, decided to print to it, if he printed 3 pages, that gal, or her maintenance equivalent, whoever was working at DEC at the time, would have to come, tear apart the computer, rebuild it, because it would get jammed up. And so Richard scratched his head. He said, well, what if we just introduce a delay after every second page? Just a little bit, so that it could dump out that page, free up the buffer, and then we can refill it with more pages. And that fixed the problem. And then he went to Xerox and he said, I fixed your problem. And they said, that's great. And he said, I'd like to give you the patch. And they said, fantastic. And they said, sign here. He said, why? They said, well, we want to take your patch, but we can't take it unless it becomes our intellectual property. And he said, what? I don't want to give that to you. And they're like, but how else are we going to give it to our customers? He says, like, I've already given it to your customers. And they're like, well, and they were verklempt, And And they were very upset, and he was very upset, and so he logically decided the only answer to this was to create an entire free operating system so that all of us can have freedom to do whatever we want with our hardware. And this is a very important lesson. Now, that might seem a little extreme, like, well, intellectual property agreement, I'll create my own Unix. But, whatever, right? And he wanted one that had certain aspects that the BSD didn't have, right? So he said, okay, well, my reaction to this is I'm going to make a world where everyone is free to do whatever they want with their hardware. And that was his original motivation, and it informs every action of the Free Software Foundation to date, up to and including the debates around GPL v3. So, very important thing. So we're going to fast forward 15 years now. Like I said, we're not going to do all the interim steps, Then the internet happened. And it was funny because as the internet was growing, two very important operating systems were being used. More than anything else. More than Solaris, more than Windows, more than anything else, people were using BSD, and then they were using Linux. And Linux was getting popular, more popular than BSD actually, for a very fundamental reason. You see what was happening right around 1997 and 1998. Chips were starting to have the ability to gang up more than one chip and actually be cost-effective and smart to do. Right? So you could buy these Pentiums, and you could start stacking them across. You could say, let's have 4 of them, let's have 2 of them, let's have even 8 of them, right, by 1999. And BSD wasn't good with multiple CPUs back then. They're very good now, don't get me wrong, but they weren't good back then. And so people were like, well, if I really want to take advantage of these extra CPUs, I kind of need to use Linux. And since all I really want to do is throw these pages down the wire, that's what I'm going to do. And so people started using Linux like crazy, and eventually it actually overtook the use of BSD. Meanwhile, the internet is growing like mad, right? This is an important year, too, because I think it's when Google was founded, too. But whatever. We used Linux at the time, too, for the same reasons. We wanted to pack as much power into as cheap a box as possible, right? And this is the internet ethic in a nutshell, right? So the world's like, wow, all these people are using Linux. And we want them to use our software on that operating system, that crazy free operating system, right? So there was a database company back then called Informix. It was bought by IBM that same year. And they were going to announce, they had this big marketing plan all set up. They were going to announce that they were going to be the first major database vendor. Of course, MySQL was happily churning out databases. But they were going to be the first database vendor to ship on this crazy hippie socialist platform, right? And Oracle found out about it. They found out about it, and a week before, Informix was going to have their beautifully orchestrated press with their embargoed stories and all their PR apparatus and IBM guys in suits ready to sell you their things. And Oracle scooped them. They said, we're shipping on Linux. Yeah, that's right. Oracle's shipping on Linux. Woo! Of course, they didn't ship for 6 months, but they were shipping on Linux. And Informix was like, hey, But it was great. People were fighting over shipping on Linux, and we're all like, wow, this is awesome. Check it out. IBM, Linux, what's up with that, right? But, it was cool. We're like, how about that? That's really neat, right? And at the same time, Microsoft's like, wow, this Linux thing it's not exactly our pal anymore, right? Because up till then, they were actually being pretty friendly. They were sharing information with the Samba team, which presents file and print services from Linux and BSD and Unix's into Windows. And they were like, I'm not sure this is going so great, this Linux thing. We should start thinking about this a little more critically. And so they dialed back the cooperation with Samba. Meanwhile, they were kind of crushing Netscape at the time. I mean, it's really no other word for it, right? So Netscape is on the rocks, and so Netscape's like, well, what should we do? They're like, well, why don't we try open sourcing Netscape? So this is when the attacks against open source really started in earnest, right? It wasn't just a technical debate. Now it was a business debate, which means you have press and you have all these people with opinions. Opinions are wonderful, but back then they started off with this. Open source is a desperate and pathetic move for Netscape. Obviously a Hail Mary pass that they're using as a last chance ditch effort to recover their business. And maybe they were right, depending on who you talk to, it was that, or it wasn't, right? I personally feel that, certain thought leaders within the company wanted it bad enough, right? Jamie Zawinski, some others, right? But, there was a little bit of the Hail Mary to it. There was a little bit of that salt on that particular wound, right? But it was okay, because we were all very excited. We're like, wow, check it out. Open source browser, kick ass, Because we had a couple of browsers going on. We had, what would become Conqueror, and whose pieces were taken out for Safari and WebKit-based browsers like the one on Android, right? But they were very much in their infancy at the time, right? So they said open source is desperate and pathetic. And then this stuff came out, and they were like, we're feeling threatened by Linux. We're feeling threatened by BSG. What do we do? Well, open source is unsupported. There's nobody who's going to help you with that stuff. Have you seen these people? I heard this. Your reporters would call me up, and they'd be like, I was working at VA Linux at the time, which sold supported Linux hardware, right? And they'd be like, well, is there any support for these things? And I'm like, yes, we're happy to take your money for that. And they're like, yes, but is there any support for these things? And I'm like, your money, me, support. And they're like, but is there any support for this? And I'm like, we actually weren't speaking the same language. What they were talking about were the IBMs and the rest, right? And there was this thing about the database, but that was about it at the time, right? And they were just spinning up their professional services around the free operating systems, which I think they've done quite well, but, So they said open source is unsupported, right? They could have gone to all these people I list up here. You can all read. I'm not going to really read the slides out to you. Unless you really want. They're very clever. But, at the end there, IBM, CA. What does CA stand for? I've forgotten. Computer Associates, because I had certificate authority, because I did the certificate job for like a couple of years. Anyway, Computer Associates, all these very large companies started really caring about Linux and offering support. So it was very cool, right? And so this argument stopped working. And they were like, well, it's really expensive. That's that support. It's crazy. CA, IBM, HP, they charge a lot. And it's like, well, wait a second. You just said that when it was cheap, you didn't want to buy it, but now it's expensive, and you're saying it's too expensive. What are you saying here? Right? And that's the funny thing about the computer business. It actually goes from unsupported to hyper expensive, right? Because people know there's not a lot to draw on, right? So you're if you need the support, well, you're going to pay for it. But the nice thing about open source is you're not just limited to one company supporting it or one network of companies to support it. Everyone can. Anybody who wants to make that money can go out and make that money. And that was really cool, right? So I'm like, okay, so the support thing doesn't work. So I started getting these calls from reporters. I'm hearing that open source is insecure. And I'm like, well, I can't imagine who you're hearing that from, right? No, really, there was a concern, people who were around in this business before Denise, Simon, you remember this. Around Perl especially, people using Perl, that's not a real language, and a lot of people still feel that way, but, it's like cartoon people swearing. See, you can always save the Perl jokes when you're thirsty. You can tell me later. So they'd say, open source is insecure. And I'd say, well, software is insecure. And open source is software, therefore, open source is insecure. Right? Well, not really, though. So what's funny about open source, and I'm not going to give you that before eyes, bugs, shallow stuff, because it doesn't work. Right? If you look at the vast majority of open source software, it's one developer messing around. Right? And that's true. But the popular open source software, the Apaches, the kernels, the other things, they don't get to become popular unless they pay attention to these very real security needs. And so what I say is that popular open source software is more secure than a proprietary equivalent. And the reason for that is because it has to be, or it doesn't become popular. Right? So that's my logic that I wanted to share with you. Right? And that eventually actually took hold. Not because of anything I did, mind you. I responded to my reporters in all the right ways. But, the reality of computer science shines through. Right? People not getting paged at 3 in the morning shines through. Right? Linux is a cancer. It's like, wow, that's a new tactic. So this is, I love coding like this because, one of my lawyers, so Google is large enough now that lawyers are actually able to spend the time to review presentations. And they're like, did he really say that? Because we have a couple of people who are newer to this space. And that's okay, by the way. That doesn't mean they're bad lawyers. It means they're just new. And I was like, yeah, he really said that. And they'll go to Google, they'll type it in, and they're like, he really said that. And it's like, yeah, they're like, but cancer's not funny. And I'm like, that's what we said, Well, yeah, this is what they said. They said Linux is cancer. They said Linux is a spoiler, communist, socialist, anti-business, lefty, right? So it's funny, the history of the socialist word with Linux. Like I said, this is entertainment, not so much learning. But so in 1998, there was this great panel discussion. It was the future of Linux, we called it, and we had Jeremy Allison, we had Linus Torvalds, we had a bunch of folks up there on stage. Actually, I think Guido was there. I don't know if Guido was in the room. someone from Intel, Sunil Saxena, and a couple other folks. And somebody went up to the mic and he said, forgive me for asking, but isn't this all communism? You guys, you're giving this stuff away, and you're all pitching together. It sounds like communism. And I was like, well, people are going to ask this, right? And Jeremy looks over at Linus and he says, aren't you from Finland? And he said, yeah. He's like, so you're not communist? He said, no, I'm socialist. And just like the whole crowd was like, oh, here we go. But when the whole SCO IBM thing was sort of in its heated up period, right, where every story was about this in the news, at least from the open source perspective, right? A bunch of free software, regulars, our troops on the ground, the secret army, they all decided to get together and go and protest at the SCO office, right, over this whole ridiculous lawsuit thing, right? And when they did that, there was a counter protest of a couple of folks inside the company who worked for Dahl, and they had signs that they had used during the 2000 election. I bet you want a recount, too. It was really weird. I mean, they literally were trying to resurrect, because this was like 2001 when this happened, and they were trying to resurrect the debates around the American election as being an equivalent to this open source. It's like, what? Are you people crazy? Well, they were. So then they said, open source is crap. It's like, oh, well, we're crap, are we? Okay. Well, then I guess no one will want to use us. And they said, well, it's not crap, but it doesn't care about real business needs. And this is a long-running thread through the history of open source. They say, you know what? You guys have got compilers, but you don't have any actually operating systems. They say, oh, well, you've got this kernel thing, but you don't really have – it's all programmer stuff, right? You've got Perl and Python and C and C++. But it's not real. It's not – you don't have anything for, like, the end user. And then OpenOffice was released from Sun. They said, well, you've got this Office suite, but you don't have you have a browser. Well, you have a browser, but you don't have databases. You have databases? Oh. You don't have business intelligence. It's like, what? And it turns out there is now. And I'm just like, wow. And it's funny because people used to ask me, well, what will never be open source? And I had this stock answer. I said, well, oil field management software. I said, that's never going to be open source. And ExxonMobil, they went into a little open source community with Chevron and with the other oil companies to create a big oil field management software. Because it was so damn expensive for any individual company to create it, they had to. They were spending on order of $500 million a year just creating software for their oil fields, their oil rigs, and all the rest. And they went to the other oil companies and said, we're not competing here. We all have to do this. Let's work together. And you see this at the high end of all the software communities. And it's just like, oh, weird, And so, it kind of supports this really real business need. And I'll talk about that with Google, too. Now, this is, well, you'll notice that I said, they said when it was somebody else. But when it doesn't say that, it's me saying it. So open source is made to meet. And what I like to remind people is that open source is written by people, right? One of the things they're trying to say right now is that open source doesn't care about the end user, right? They're trying this thing again. But the reality is open source people are the end user. And the best open source applications are the ones of which the open source developers are the end user, because they know the bugs that they're creating when they create their software. They know what they have to fix. They know what features they want. And that's really cool, right? And in general, they don't want – so this is a red herring, and I apologize for that. I really shouldn't use red herrings when I'm doing this. But so I say, and they don't want to waste their time writing yet another stupid function, another stupid library, or another CMS, and that's why we only have one CMS and only one database and one kernel and one compiler. Okay, people obviously like rewriting code. And if you actually look at what people are doing, the things they don't rewrite are things like, an XML parsing library that they can just include, right? Or some other library tool, right? But it turns out they like rewriting this stuff. They like rewriting it all the time. I mean, how many XML processing libraries are there for Perl? It's like all XML parsing libraries now, right? I'm sorry I keep on calling on them, but they sat up front. So, so why are people doing this open source stuff again? If they keep on rewriting stuff, they're not getting that productivity gain. It's not that. It's not rank laziness, right? So why are they doing it? Well, we asked them, right? There were a lot of people going out there saying it's a cargo cult, it's a gift economy. It's like, why don't you just ask them? So we did. We asked 10,000 developers on SourceForge. We said, why are you actually doing this stuff? Right? Is it some sort of weird thing? And it wasn't. It was just people who wanted to be smarter, right? They wanted to become better at what they did. They didn't want to wake up at 3 in the morning by their pager, right? I ran a network of 1,200 Microsoft Mail for the Macintosh users when they were converting from PowerPC from the 68K processors. I was woken up every hour for 3 months. I didn't want that. That's a shitty job. That's a terrible job, right? Yeah, cheap laughs from the swear words. And then there was idealism. They're like, I want to share this technology with my friends. I want to share this with my colleagues. I want to make computer science better. That's really cool. And then only down here at the bottom was it about not liking somebody else. Right? It was about, I want to kill Microsoft or whatever. Right? This is cool, because it was never for me about that. I love computers, right? If it was a world without open source, I'd still love them, right? But yeah, this was really cool to find out. This is people who developers, people who are coding, right? That's why they're doing it. That's pretty great, right? And then they said, well, open source is unprofessional. Open source is made by a bunch of drunk, long-haired, lecherous hippies. So that's Alan Cox, long hair. That's Linus drinking a beer. That's Miguel. He's just cute and young, whatever. That's Jeremy dressed up as a lecherous old fella. That's Guido, but I'm sure there's beer somewhere. There's beer all over this thing, and there's people making out. I mean, yeah, so that's true. Because like I said, software is made by people. People are people, right? So then I said open source is a dangerous thing. It is coming right for us. It is going to ruin America and American business. And that's kind of true, right? It has this potential. What open source does do to the computer industry is very, very interesting. It removes some opportunities for traditional licensing revenue. This is absolutely true. But it doesn't mean that it's bad. It's just, it does change things. If you wanted to go out and create a new Unix right now, from scratch, you'd be insane. How many of you think that'd be a good idea? Okay, see? I mean, well, that's tyranny of the majority, right? But, if you're creating a new Unix now, it's because you want to. It's not because you need to make money from it, right? Or maybe you have some plan that I don't understand. It's coming from everywhere. It can't be made to go away, right? So it's one of those things you can either get on the train or you can get run over by it or start farming off on the side, whatever. It's a bad analogy. But so who got crushed? Well, Coherent got crushed. Coherent was a vendor of Unix, inexpensive Unix. SCO is in some state of crushedness. There used to be a lot of compiler vendors. People forget this. There were a lot of very talented developers working on compilers. They still are. They're just not working for compiler companies. They don't exist anymore. And there's probably like one or two, don't get me wrong. But there were a lot of them before. That doesn't exist anymore. A bunch of workstation companies got marginalized out, right? If your business was largely low-end Unix workstations, bye-bye. That was a tough world. That was a tough thing, a tough lesson to learn. And most people who sold software that competed where open source was insanely great, web servers and the rest. This is a hard road to hoe. And this is something that people have to understand. We don't worry about creating these kinds of tools anymore because open source has done that, which gives us a lot of opportunity above that layer. But there were a lot of people doing this. Or they're Microsoft, right? Microsoft is still a very successful company selling proprietary software that competes with open source. So, open source is good for you. This is me saying that, right? So some people said, well, wait a second. Why don't we take this effort, the societal effort we've been making in recreating compilers and recreating Unixes and recreating these tools and see what else we can do with that, right? And so Oracle, IBM, I include ourselves, Google, we're very good users of open source software. I talk about how we give back, too. It's not just about use. But, people got in front of it. They said, well, there's an opportunity here. And maybe we don't understand what that opportunity is yet. But it's there, so let's figure this out. And many people have. So another argument that people would say, and I didn't put it in the they said format, they would say open source is unusable, difficult to maintain, difficult to configure. This is software in a nutshell, though. Software is difficult to maintain and difficult to configure. I list some half joking, half not. Complex software is complex to administer, right? I think that's the nature of complex tools. And that's not open source or proprietary, that's software, right? And we have a lot of things, and actually we're talking about, if I can pimp the company, we're talking about a lot of really cool technology that makes software development easier, software scaling easier. And that's remarkable, this work. But complex software is often complex. That doesn't change just because it's open source or because it's proprietary. So I should probably rework this slide to make it a little nicer, but whatever. And because I'm basically slagging on other software here. But somebody said something? Put SAP on it too. Everyone's like, I have an application I hate. So one of the things I like to point out to people is open source is fast. This is good and bad, mind you, right? There's a lot of exciting work going on in the open source world. It's not standing still. If anyone ever tries to tell you that open source is people are dinosaurs in the open source world, obsessed with their Unixes and all the rest, that's crazy talk. Open source is remarkable. And I'm not trying to slag on anybody here when I say this. There was a person in the Linux kernel, they're like, we get more patches in one day than most proprietary software will get in its lifetime, right? Even most open source for that matter, right? So it's like once you have a project that's got some steam built up, it's remarkable. It's really something. And if it's mature enough, it's also, those patches represent responsiveness to user concerns. And that can be a problem, right? Because people make money off of computers when they break. It's harder to make money off of computers when they don't, right? If you can charge that monthly revenue for going in and cleaning up a log file or whatever it is you have to do to maintain a monthly revenue stream from bad software, that's good money, right? But I actually believe this. I think that open source is a problem for consultancies because it's really good. It's designed to be really good. It's designed to be reliable, right? And you see this with people who work in the open source world. They've learned that try to make the money on the integration services, the feature add-ons, whatever. But if you go down the support route, it's not going to be as lucrative sometimes. And this is tough on people because for a lot of folks, the money in open source was a support story, right? So one of the things I like to point out is open source is free. You don't have to pay for it. So Google has 14 computers, right? So if we had to pay for proprietary operating systems on all 14 of those computers, it would be a substantial amount of money, non-trivial amounts of money, right? No matter who you are, right? And it's free. It's free as in beer sometimes. And that's important because software costs money. If you don't spend it on the software, you can spend it on something else, the hardware, for instance. But it also is that freedom to do with it as you please. This is, review for a lot of you. I know that. But you're also free to not use it. You're free to go away. You're free to go do what you want with it, right? We have some patches in the Linux kernel in our data centers that are absurd. They're crazy, Like if anybody else, if they told me about that before I started there, I'd really question about working there, right? But they make sense for us, right? So we do them, right? And it's cool. But there's this other freedom that nobody ever talks about, right? When Google was using MySQL 4.0, 4x really, everyone else had moved on to 5, except for people like Google, right? And we had these patches. And these patches made replication really much better for MySQL 4x. And so, we went to MySQL and said, do you want these? They're like, we're kind of moved on. We're in the 5 land. And we have stuff like that already in 5. And we're like, okay. So we just released it ourselves, right? And a bunch of people adopted this stuff because they hadn't gone on to 5x yet. And then it was funny. It was actually an opportunity for MySQL to make money off of patches that somebody else had created. Because they went to them and said, please support us on these Google patches. And they're like, okay, and they figured it out, and we made it so they could bring it into a later version of the software. But, we were free to release those patches into the community of people who has the same problems that we do. And we do this more often than we really talk about because it can be seen as being very aggressive. And, we don't want to be seen as that kind of company. But the reality is that freedom to create your own fork, your own branch, your own community within a larger community of open source developers is incredibly powerful, especially as you start really becoming a heavy user of this technology. Right? So I talked about this already, so I'm just going to skip it. Open source is all around. So how many of you own a thing? You all own things? Well, so the reality is that GCC is used to develop almost everything that has a battery, a chip, a washing machine, whatever. It's like GCC is almost ubiquitous in the embedded space. And that's going to be true until LLVM rises to the fore. And then the story will be the BSD licensed LLVM compiler. I firmly believe that. I know that sounds a little unusual because I'm really calling a shot that's 5 years, 7 years down the pike. But yeah, open source compilers matter, right? They make, basically if they didn't exist, we would have to create them. A BlackBerry, I don't know if my little green laser has this chip in it, but if it does, GCC, right? So yeah, and obviously every time you visit Google. Open source runs the internet. We've already talked about this at many, many talks. You can go look at these stats yourself. Open source runs business, runs the world. It's magic. So this is the intermission before I start the Google part. So I have 19 minutes. So really 9 minutes to give question time. But we'll work it out. So open source is magic for Google, right? And what does that mean? Well, I'll tell you, coincidentally enough. It's magically easy for us to use. It's very easy for us to bring code into Google. Well, Google is very lucky in that we kind of don't ship a lot of things. I mean, we have Google Earth and Picasa and the search appliance. But considering the amount of engineering that goes on at Google and the amount of open source we use, we don't use open source in such a way that demands a lot from a compliance standpoint. So we're very lucky there, right? But the coolest thing about open source for all companies, right, is that they use the same licenses. Remember I talked about the 99.99999 bar case? The bar in math, Anyway, the great thing about that is you can go to your lawyer and say, listen, I have this piece of MIT license code. What do you think of it? And they go, oh, the MIT license. Well, we're pretty used to that. We've seen that before. So if you see an MIT license, this is all you need to know, X, Y, Z. Same thing is true of all the other popular open source licenses. See, the thing is, software has licenses. Every piece of software. How many of you have a Macintosh? Sorry, an iPhone. So if you look at the iPhone in the legal section, it's a great little document. It's like 20 pages long of all the open source licenses that are in there. It's really easy, once you get comfortable with a license, to just bring it in. Bring in all that functionality, have your many, many engineers not working on that functionality and working on things that are cool for you, your value add, as it were. That's really powerful. People don't realize how powerful that is. When I do a joint development deal, with a university, it doesn't look like standard joint development deals. And I get it done in about 3 weeks, which is impossible. All I say to them is like, listen, I'm going to give you money, and you're going to write code, and you're going to release it under an Apache license. If you don't release it under the Apache license, you won't get the second half of the money. That's it. That's the deal, right? We structure it as we sometimes have a statement of work, and that takes a little bit of time in the legal area. But if that university can release open source code, we're done from an intellectual property standpoint. If I want to enter into a traditional joint development agreement where we end up owning intellectual property, it can take 6 to 9 months. And this is not just universities, right? If you do this with companies, 6 to 9 months. If you do it with the Free Software Foundation, if you want to have a broad-based agreement with the Free Software Foundation saying any Googler can give you a patch and you can accept it, that took me 2 years, right? Joint development, joint intellectual property is really hard. And it's not because anybody doesn't want to do it. And it's not because people are evil or wrong or want more control or less control, although it feels like that at the time. It's just complicated and busy, and everyone's busy. So it takes forever. But once you get used to these licenses, once you put that in there and say, listen, that's the deal. People say, well, we understand the Apache license. They release it. We already understand as a company on how to pull it in. There's no weird copyright getting moved around and all the rest. It's easy. It's simple. It's great, right? And the nice thing about it, too, is as a company, we've created common tools that look for these licenses and can track them so that when we do release a Google search appliance, a Picasa, and the rest, we know exactly what we're releasing. So we know exactly what the intellectual property standpoint is there. And that's really important from just a governance standpoint. So it's fundamental to us. Every time you use Google, you're using Linux. Every single one of those 14 servers is running Linux. And all the software in there was built using GCC and open source compilers. Every single one of them, right? And so it's really important to us. The languages, people think of Google as doing all this crazy stuff with open source, but where it matters most to us are these fundamental levels, Linux, the compilers. And our teams come from the mainstream Linux, the mainstream compiler world, right? And they're able to release, and they do release quite often. We're now like the 11th most common patcher into the Linux kernel, which is not bad considering we only really started doing active patching about 4 years ago. I mean, Red Hat, Sun, and all the rest, they're way ahead of us, but they've been doing it much longer. So I feel pretty good about that. And then you have all the software we've built, and they use libraries that are out there that are useful to us. And there's some libraries that jump out at you all the time, like OpenSSL, PCRE, and those very common ones, right? But then it's all long tail. People love the word long tail. Well, there's a long tail of open source libraries out there, it turns out, especially in the Java world. And that's really useful to us. Oh, yeah, and MySQL. You can't forget MySQL. Amazingly useful tool for us. So these are kinds of things that we rely on, we love. We do whatever we can to help. And that's nice, right? So I talked about time and legal, blah, 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 blah. But the thing I want to mention is when we do release, we generally release under Apache than any other license. We've released under the EPL, the LGPL, the GPL, GPL v3, v2, you name it, right? But we generally release under the Apache license because we feel that's the fairest license for all of us. Inside there's the statement about patents. There's a statement about trademarks. It says when you use this code, you know that anything in there that came from Google that is a Google patent, we're saying to you that patent that we're expressing in this code is yours to use free of charge and for your users to use free of charge. And that's something that the Apache license and the GPL v3 do quite well, and none of the other licenses do it. Right? So, there's some minority licenses, but again, we don't try to use those, right? So that's really important. There's also wording in there about use of trademark and stuff that matters to us too. So you can't basically release your piece of software that uses some Google technology and say Google, 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 Google. Although you kind of can. It's complicated. We actually were very happy when you use our APIs, though, so just come talk to us anyway. And then you, as a developer, can take this code and know exactly what we're talking about. It's not the Google open source license. It's not the Google Creative Commons text license. It's the Creative Commons license. It's the Apache license. It's the GPL. It's the LGPL. You know what we mean because those licenses exist outside of Google. In sort of a cynical way, you don't have to trust us because you already trust Apache because they are trustworthy. They're worthy of it, right? Even if you don't think we are, and I think we are, but you don't have to. And that's another great thing about third-party licenses. And why you should be suspicious of new open source licenses that are created just for one thing, one release, one company. They're specious, and that's why. So that's kind of how I'm wrapping up. I just want to talk about the Summer of Code. It's a project we do. So if you look back at when I just first started at Google some 4 years ago, one of the things that people would come up to me, they come to me in these conferences and they say, listen, yeah, Google's fine, thanks for searching all that, but my friend Tom was working on this open source project. He went to go work for Google, and I haven't seen a patch from him since. And it wasn't that Tom hated the project or he didn't even want a patch. So sometimes when they came to Google, they found that some of the problems we had were really interesting. And I have to be honest with you. After you've worked on a single piece of software for 5 years, 10 years, or in the case of Vim, which Bram's been working on, I think, 20 years, sometimes you don't want to do it anymore. You're tired of it, right? And maybe there isn't someone to pick it up. And so people go away sometimes. So we thought to ourselves, this is a problem, right? Not that Google is a huge part of this, but this just happens. And if you went to open source, you guys have been to a lot of how many people at the Perl conferences are the same people you met 12 years ago? All of them, right? Right, so it's about half. That's good. But you started seeing the same people over and over and over again. You're like, this is driving me crazy. I like you guys. I like all of you. But I'd like to meet more of you. And I'd like more of you to work on open source. It's not good for open source for us all to keep on getting continually older, right? If we're relying on Linus for the kernel 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 40 years from now, he's going to die eventually, right? We're all going to die, right? But shouldn't this work live on? This is the great thing about open source, is it doesn't die with the company or the developer. It's still there, right? So we said, well, how can we create more of these people? How can we do that? And Larry Page came up to me. I'd been at Google maybe 8 months, right? And we had launched code.google.com for compliance purposes and for the beginnings of our API story. And he said to me, Chris, I want you to do me a favor. I was like, okay, what's that? He said, well, there are a lot of computer science students who over the summer aren't doing computer science. Yeah? He goes, I want you to fix that. And I'm like, really? He's like, yeah, go do that. And he gave me some targets and just go fix that. And I was like, okay. And so Greg and I are like, well, what do we do? We're functionally kind of lazy people, but we're the open source people. So we know all these open source people. What if we gave them students? And so we kicked off the Summer of Code, where we would pay students to work on open source software over the summer. That first year, we had 200 people, and we told Larry Page, we're like, well, we think 200 people is the right number. And he's like, you can't do 1,000? And I'm like, no, I can't do 1,000. And he's like, well, why not? I'm like, because I'm only one person. And he's like, well, you should fix that too. And I'm like, I'm like, oh, okay, And all these people applied to take part, and we're like, oh, we're throwing around. It was absurdly badly, handled from a web app perspective. We were basically throwing around spreadsheets, really, with 6,000 applications in them. Anyway, and so we doubled it to 400 that year, and that was cool. And then we went to 600, and then we went to 900. Now we're at 1,100 kids. So it's a great project. It introduces people to open source, but it also introduces computer scientists to real user needs. This is something none of you need to be reminded of, but I don't know if you can remember, for those of you who went to computer science school, you're given theory, you're given practice, you're given homework, you're given a couple group projects, but you're not given users. Right? For the most part, you're not. Your users are yourselves and ostensibly your teacher, but they're not going to be filing bug reports and saying, I really need this, or you corrupted my database. Right? So it's a really great project because they're exposed to actual computer science. I don't know how many of them leave the field after this. But isn't it better they leave now? but But seriously, it's a great project. So that's the Summer of Code. That's this year. We've had over 1,500 graduates. We have 2,000 to 3,000 mentors who have mentored students over the last 4 years. This year we're in I think it's 95 countries. And it's pretty remarkable. Last year alone we created 2.5 million, 2.1 million, depending on how you count. And lines of code, by the way, is a terrible measure of anything. We know this. A line of Perl is not the same thing as a line of Python, clearly. It's not the same as a line of C, and so on and so forth. I mean, we had some students who had generated 30,000 lines of code for their projects. Some were 2,000, right? But we sort of said, okay, seems like a happy center is around 3,000 lines of code. So we figured we generated about 2.1 million lines of code last year. And that's code that goes back and benefits Google for sure, but it benefits all of us and keeps open source healthy. And that's pretty remarkable. This one student, right? So Fyodor, who created Nmap and is a remarkable security developer, the first years of the Summer of Code, he took on 10 developers all by himself. And we're like, are you crazy? Well, he was. But that's okay. He was also really, really good at what he did. So this was one of them. And so Adriano did an Nmap project, passed with flying colors. It's a merit-based program. We fail about 20% of the students every year. He passed with flying colors. And then he said, the problem with Nmap is it's kind of ugly. So he had seen the use of Nmap in the Matrix movies. And so he created UMIT, which is a really pretty interface on Nmap. And UMIT stands for Use Me Instead Trinity, right? And so in later movies, people use the UMIT interface onto Nmap because it's prettier, right? So that's sort of like a funny joke. But the reality is he created a new project. He's a mentor. He's run a bunch of students through it, and they both have terrific projects now. And so open source has gotten better, and that's the goal. So why are we doing this? Well, it's good for us, sure, but it's really good for the internet. Remember, the internet runs on open source, right? And the reason why the internet is a great business and a great opportunity for all of us is because it can't really block any of us out. You can't be locked out of developing for the internet, right? The way you can on proprietary platforms, right? I mean, that's just how it is, right? You're going to be able to get your DNS address. You're going to be able to send traffic to it. You're going to be able to serve your customers. That's really cool. And it's really cool because of open source software. They are so intimately intertwined, right? You're able to build value on top of the internet because of open source. And so we wanted to make sure that open source remained healthy and presented that opportunity ongoing. So that's what's good for the internet, and what's good for the internet is good for Google, as you heard earlier, and that's very, very true. And that's it. I'll take any questions. There's a microphone right here, and we have 6 minutes and 36 seconds. 34. That's the microphone there. Or I can tell more stories. I'd rather answer questions. Hi.
You talked about Summer of Code. Could you talk about the highly open participation project a little bit?
Oh, sure, yes. So Leslie Hawthorne, who works for me, she, for about 2 years, she was like, we should do a high school program. I'm like, yeah, we should, but I really don't want to talk to parents, okay? And so I was like, why don't we just get through the Summer of Code, as like a delaying tactic because it's always so all-engrossing. And so she finally came to me. She came to me fall of last year, and she said, okay, I'm going to launch the high school program. And I'm like, okay. I said to her, this is really my guidelines. I was like, there's 2 things I need from you, though. And she's like, what's that? I was like, I can't talk to parents, okay? She's like, that's fine. I was like, and I can't talk to parents. She's like, fine. So she launched it, and she had 400 students taking part over basically the winter. It went like November, December, January-ish. And we had 400 students do over 1,000 tasks. They were smaller. And the idea was if you do 3 tasks, you win an award of $100. And And so they were able to stack them up and make some money, but also do some open source. And it was really cool. We had some students that I think there was one student that did something like 43 tasks. I mean, just amazing work. And I have to tell you something. It's like I had projects come to me and saying, we've got a problem. I'm like, what's that? They're like, we don't have anything left to do. I mean, that was what they said. And I'm like, really? And they're like, yeah, every word is spelled correctly on our website. Every page looks beautiful. We've got great themes all across. Because they were allowed to do very small tasks, right? And like, yeah, they're all done. I'm like, really? They're like, yeah, they're all done. They're just done. And they'd come up with hundreds of them, right? And that's kind of how it worked out. So that's the highly open participation program. We want to do it again. We'll probably do it again in the fall, is my guess, once the summer code's wrapped up. And so have them sort of ping pong off each other, so it's pretty cool. And also, it does answer this question of what if people do, because summer code is only open to people 18 or over. And we'd have these kids show up who are just brilliant. I don't know if Guido's in the room, but there's a 13-year-old who's doing more work on Python right now than Guido, right? And it's just like, wow, how do we help that kid? It's just remarkable stuff. So, anyways.
So,
you want an apology for the Perl joke, right?
I want to fight. A lot of people kind of, principles are all well and good, but, a lot of people swore they'd never use proprietary software again, kind of post 1999 or whatever. And then OS X came out and all the geeks switched to that. And people swore they'd never see adverts on the internet until AdWords came out, and it was frictionless to go and put ads on your blog, and then suddenly everyone's got AdWords because, it doesn't matter if it's just me, One of the reasons why people, sorry, that was a little dig there. One of the reasons why people do open source, because it's just not worth selling their stuff. It's, the overhead of trying to sell your software would be way too much for the effort you're putting in for your little Perl
or even the value you might get from it.
Yeah. But if somebody came along and provided like a zero friction sales thing, kind of like the iPhone App Store, something like that, do you ever worry that that a lot of this stuff, a lot of the little things would go away, kind of like the OS X kind of little app market where people charge you $10 for wraparound rsync or something like that? Do you ever worry about that?
So you're kind of asking a larger question in my mind. You can tell me if I've got it wrong. And you're asking me, is there a time when computer science is done? I don't mean to make you sound like a Luddite by saying it that way, but I do think that there are times when software is pretty much done.
Yeah.
Right? And I think that open source is very, very good at finding that kind of software and not just commoditizing it, but making the open source one the done one. Right? Because it serves the right needs for the right users, and that's it. So the question then becomes, is the needs of the end user community large enough to accommodate more and more programs and applications and all the rest? And I think the answer is yes. And I think it'll go in fits and starts, though. So I don't know if you remember before the internet really took hold. So I mentioned that horrific email network that I ran, right? But it really was the best solution for a Macintosh network at the time. And it didn't get better until the internet took hold, right? Exchange was being sampled and stuff. But people really weren't into email. I mean, I had 1,200 Type A boutique lawyers as my clients. They weren't into email. It was that joke, where they'd have their administrative assistant print out their email. We had those guys. They exist. They still exist today, probably, but, it'd be really weird now. But it was just mildly weird back then for a guy like me, right? But it was very normal back then. So there are things that I think that happen. So I think that once the United States actually has really fast broadband, things will change again. The kinds of applications we present will change. And I think we're sort of here to talk about that kind of thing, right? But so I think we're actually in a very good part right now where there's way more demand, way more opportunity than there is done applications. But we're talking philosophy here more than we are anything else. So there's more Perl programmers today than there were 10 years ago, even though Perl might be perceived as being on the decline because there's such a demand, right? It's a great time to be a computer. In a very strange occurrence, I gave a commencement speech at a computer science department like last week, and the speech was, "You picked the right career. You all did, right? This is a great time to be a computer scientist. This is a great time to be a programmer. This is a great time to be a project manager or a person in computers because the demand is astonishing, And I know people were worried for a bit that it was all going to other countries, but it turns out the demand was so big that it cannot be filled by the current population of humanity that can work a computer the way we can. So I think that we're in a very good place. And I think that the projects that open source may be a spoiler for, depending on how you want to say it, may service that need wholly and completely, are so small, and there's so much more opportunity. I think we're in a good place for, I don't know, 20 more years? Ask me again in 20 years, right? 30 years, 50 years, right? So.
Hi, Chris. One question.
Okay.
For non-Googleites, is there a silver bullet for how do you make money out of this magic?
How do I make money off this magic? So if I were not at Google, what would I do? I would be figuring something out. You know, I really think there's a lot of opportunity right now. I think that people who understand open source are more effective and productive and are able to create solutions and products much faster from the open source base. And so, you know, none of you would, how many of you are writing your own web server? Yeah, you are. Well, you know, there's probably room for it. Right. But it's like, you know, not many of you are writing your own web servers. Certainly none of you are writing your own well, maybe you're firmware people, but you know, there are very few people who are writing their own fundamental infrastructure, right? Most people are working way above that level. And that's a very good place to be. But I think I'm out of time. I'm seeing the blinky red light, right? So I've been asked that you fill out these evaluation forms. And that'd be really good, too. So any comments you might have, I actually will read them because you'll give them to me. Yeah? It's funny, you know, I have to be honest with you. For the last 10 years, I've given talks. I've never seen an evaluation form. But I would really welcome them because I know that since we're running this thing, I'll see them. So please take the time to fill them out. And thank you for coming.